When you turn 40, people expect you to have everything figured out. A career. A family. A path you can walk without hesitation. But what if, at that age, the question that keeps echoing inside your heart isn't about success or children or stability? What if it's about love? What if the quiet voice inside asks, asterisk, will you ever marry a woman? Asterisk, it isn't a question you can laugh away. It lingers when you pour your morning coffee. It whispers when you look at the mirror too long. It aches when you see couples walking hand in hand, while your own hands feel strangely empty. 40 is supposed to mean maturity, wisdom, and peace. Instead, it sometimes feels like a storm waiting for a safe harbor. You remember the years spent hiding pieces of yourself. The moments you smiled for others while swallowing your truth. The times you convinced yourself it was too late, that the chance had passed, that love like that belonged only to the young. But deep down, you know desire doesn't follow calendars. The heart doesn't read numbers, it only knows what it wants, and yours has always wanted the same thing. A woman's voice to calm the chaos. A woman's laughter to break the silence. A woman's love to finally feel like home. That question doesn't go away. At 40, it only grows louder. 40 feels different than you ever imagined. People told you it would be a milestone, a number that carried weight, something to celebrate with parties, balloons, and laughter echoing in the air. But when the candles were blown out, and the guests left, and silence filled the house, all that was left was a question that refused to fade. Will you marry a woman? It was not a passing thought, not the kind that visits when you're tired or lonely. It was deeper, like a seed that had been buried for years, waiting for the right season to push through the soil. Now, it had sprouted, and there was no ignoring it. Every morning, you wake up and carry it with you. The steam from your coffee fogs the kitchen window, and you stare at your reflection, trying to recognize the person you've become. Successful on paper, steady in the eyes of others, yet incomplete. A quiet emptiness curls in your chest, and the thought of what might have been, what could still be, whispers like a haunting melody. For years, you told yourself there wasn't time. You told yourself the world wouldn't understand. You convinced yourself that love had limits, that your longing for a woman's touch was something you could bury under routine, under work, under what everyone else wanted from you. But the truth has claws, and the older you get, the sharper they dig in. You cannot escape it anymore. You find yourself replaying moments you didn't think mattered. A glance that lingered longer than it should have. A hand brushing against yours and leaving your skin burning hours later. The ache you felt when she smiled at someone else. All those pieces you dismissed as harmless now pile into something undeniable. 40 has stripped away the excuses, leaving only the truth. You want love, real love, the kind that feels like freedom instead of compromise. And yet, the thought scares you as much as it excites you. There's a voice inside, an old one, trained by years of doubt, that asks if it's too late. It reminds you of every missed chance, every moment you chose silence over honesty, every time you walked away because fear was stronger than desire. That voice asks cruel questions. Who will love you now? Who will understand you at this age? Who will accept the truth you kept hidden for so long? You stand in front of the mirror, searching for an answer in your own eyes, and the silence hurts more than the questions. But there is another voice too, softer, buried under years of hesitation, yet growing louder every day. It tells you that love has no deadline. That happiness doesn't check calendars. That 40 is not an ending, but a beginning, if you are brave enough to step into it. You hold on to that voice, trembling and unsure, but unwilling to let go. Nights are the hardest. When the world is quiet and your thoughts take shape in the darkness, you find yourself imagining what it would feel like to come home to someone who sees you, all of you, without judgment or expectation. To hear laughter in your living room again, not from visitors but from love that belongs there. To feel warmth next to you in bed that isn't just the echo of a dream. You imagine her, faceless and yet familiar, a presence your heart already knows. You picture the softness of her hair, the safety of her arms, the way she might look at you like you are enough. The fantasy is both beautiful and cruel because it reminds you of what you're missing, but it also keeps hope alive. And maybe hope is what has carried you this far. When you walk outside, the world looks the same to everyone else. A woman in her 40s, put together, smiling at neighbors, busy with work, independent. But inside, a quiet revolution is taking place. You are no longer satisfied with pretending. You no longer want to survive on what others think is enough. You crave something raw, something true, something that belongs only to you and the woman you dare to love. That question, will you marry a woman, is not just about marriage. It is about courage. It is about finally admitting what your heart has known all along. It is about the promise that maybe, just maybe, it's not too late to live the life you've been denying yourself. And as the days pass, that promise begins to feel less like a dream and more like a path waiting to be walked, if only you have the strength to take the first step. Memories come back in waves, uninvited but relentless, and they don't ask for permission before they take over your thoughts. At 40, it is impossible not to look back, not to measure your present against the years that have already passed. You remember being a teenager, sitting in your room with the door locked, listening to love songs on the radio and wondering why the lyrics about boys never reached you the same way they seemed to reach your friends. You laughed when they talked about crushes on boys in class, but the truth was, you were studying the girl sitting 2 rows ahead of you, memorizing the way her ponytail swung when she laughed. You told yourself it was harmless, just admiration, nothing to confess. That was the first time you lied to yourself, and it would not be the last. Through your 20s, the world moved quickly. Friends were falling in love, marrying, building homes. You joined in the rituals, the parties, the small talk, all while carrying a secret like a stone in your chest. You dated men because that was what you thought you were supposed to do, nodding along when your friends said you were lucky to be with someone stable. But late at night, staring at the ceiling, you felt a hollowness you could not explain. You remember one man in particular, kind and attentive, who told you he loved you. You wanted so badly to feel it back, to let the words spark something in your heart, but they sat heavy in the air, empty for you. You smiled and pretended, convincing yourself that maybe love was meant to feel this way, calm and safe but without fire. You carried on like that for years, performing in a play where the role had been chosen for you. The world applauded your normality, your steadiness, your quiet compliance. But your heart grew more restless, like a bird locked in a cage, beating its wings against the bars in silence. Then there were the moments that shattered your lies. A brush of fingers against yours from a woman who made you laugh until your stomach hurt. A long conversation that stretched into the early hours, her voice lingering in your mind long after you parted. The way your heart raced, uninvited and unstoppable, reminding you of what you had been denying. Those moments terrified you, but they also kept you alive. They told you the fire was still there, waiting. In your 30s, you tried to bury it deeper. Career became your shield, your excuse. You told yourself you were too busy, that relationships could wait, that independence was strength. And yes, you were strong. You built a life others envied. You traveled, you bought your own home, you filled your days with responsibilities that left little time for reflection. But loneliness has a way of finding cracks, and it seeps in when you least expect it. At family gatherings, when cousins introduced their spouses. At weddings, when brides looked at their partners with eyes full of devotion. On quiet Sundays, when your phone stayed silent, and you realized no one was checking in, no one was waiting for you. You tried to silence the ache by telling yourself you had chosen freedom, that solitude was better than disappointment. But the truth never fully disappeared. It came in whispers, in dreams, in fleeting desires that felt too real to ignore. Now, at 40, those memories are heavier than ever. They remind you of every moment you stayed quiet when your heart begged you to speak. They remind you of every door you closed before you even tried to open it. And yet, beneath the regret, there is also a glimmer of understanding. All those years of hiding, of pretending, of fearing, have led you here. To this moment of reckoning, where the question refuses to leave you alone. Will you marry a woman? The past answers with silence, with the weight of missed chances. But your heart, even bruised and cautious, still beats with the possibility that the story is not over yet. It happened in the most ordinary way, the kind of moment that doesn't seem significant until it refuses to leave your mind. You were standing in line at a cafe, scrolling absently through your phone, when a voice beside you caught your attention. It wasn't loud or demanding, just warm, steady, carrying a softness that felt strangely familiar. You glanced up, and there she was. She wasn't the type of woman who made heads turn instantly, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence that pulled you in before you even realized it. Her hair was loose, falling naturally over her shoulders, and her smile, when she caught your eyes by accident, felt like sunlight finding its way into a room you hadn't realized was dark. You told yourself not to linger, not to make anything of it, but the truth was, your heart had already reacted. It skipped, jolted, betrayed you in a way you couldn't hide from yourself. The line moved slowly, and in that stillness, you found yourself noticing small details. The way she tapped her fingers lightly against the counter, as though humming a tune only she could hear. The way her laughter slipped out when the barista cracked a small joke, filling the air with something effortless. And then she turned to you, perhaps just to be polite, perhaps because she felt the weight of your gaze. "Busy morning, huh?" she said, and the casual words felt heavier than they should. You smiled back, trying to steady your voice, replying with something simple, but inside, something shifted. You left the cafe that day with more than a cup of coffee. You left with her face burned into your memory, with the sound of her voice echoing in your ears, with a question you didn't want to ask yourself yet. Could it really be possible, after everything, after years of silence and fear, to meet someone who awakens this part of you again? You told yourself it was chance, that you would never see her again, that it was just another fleeting encounter meant to tease your heart. But life has a way of bending when you least expect it. A week later, you saw her again, not at the cafe this time, but in the grocery store, standing in the aisle, studying two different brands of tea as if the choice carried the weight of the world. You hesitated, debating whether to walk past or to say something. Your pulse quickened, the old fear rising. Don't draw attention, don't let anyone see, but the pull was too strong. You stepped forward, your voice unsteady but genuine. "If you need an opinion, the one on the left is my favorite." She looked up, and recognition lit her face. That smile again, warmer this time, as if she remembered you too. The conversation was short, about tea, about mornings, about how funny it was to run into each other again. But beneath the casual exchange, you felt it, an ease, a thread tying you to her, thin but undeniable. When you parted ways, you felt the absence of her presence as soon as she turned the corner. You walked away holding on to something you hadn't felt in years, anticipation. In the days that followed, you found yourself restless, replaying the meetings in your mind, wondering if fate was trying to whisper something to you. You told yourself not to be foolish, not to expect anything, but the thought of her lingered, growing stronger instead of fading. And then, almost like an answer to the silent longing, you crossed paths once more. This time she stopped first, her voice filled with a familiarity that steadied your racing heart. We keep running into each other. Maybe the universe is trying to tell us something. You laughed, but the sound trembled with a truth you didn't want to admit. The universe, or whatever force had brought her into your orbit, was stirring something inside you that you had long convinced yourself was buried. You walked away that day with her number written on a small piece of paper, your hand shaking as you tucked it into your pocket. For the first time in a long time, possibility didn't feel like a stranger. It felt like the beginning of something you had been waiting your whole life to feel. The first call was hesitant, almost awkward, like testing the strength of a fragile bridge before stepping fully onto it. You stared at her number on your phone for days, your thumb hovering over it, your chest tightening each time. When you finally pressed call, you expected your voice to betray you, to crack under the weight of nerves. But the moment she answered, the nervousness softened. Her voice was warm, unhurried, as if she had been waiting for you too. That night you talked for nearly 2 hours, about nothing and everything, favorite books, small childhood memories, the way certain songs could transport you back to forgotten moments. The conversation didn't feel forced. It flowed, gentle but steady, like a river you didn't realize you had been thirsting for all along. When you hung up, you sat in the quiet, phone pressed to your chest, feeling the echo of her presence like warmth that refused to leave. One call turned into another. Then messages that stretched through the day, filling the empty spaces of your routine. Work emails became less important when her name lit up your screen. You found yourself smiling in the middle of mundane tasks, laughing at a message that was simple yet touched something deep inside you. She began to feel less like chance and more like inevitability, as though she had always been meant to arrive at this exact moment in your life. You noticed how the loneliness that once sat heavy on your shoulders was quietly lifting, replaced by a lightness you hadn't felt in years. When you finally agreed to meet outside of those chance encounters, you felt your pulse hammering with both fear and excitement. You chose a small park cafe, tucked away from the noise, where the trees leaned in close as though offering shelter. You arrived first, your palms damp, your mind rehearsing possible words. And then she walked in, her presence immediately filling the space, and every practiced line vanished. She smiled at you like you were someone she had known forever, and suddenly, being there felt natural. Conversation flowed as easily as it had on the phone, but now there were glances, pauses, moments when her laughter pulled you in so strongly you almost forgot to breathe. Time blurred that afternoon. Hours passed without you noticing, until the sun began to dip and the air turned cooler. Neither of you seemed eager to leave, stretching the moments as long as possible. As you walked together out of the cafe, she brushed lightly against your arm, a small accidental touch that sent a current through your body. You tried to mask the shiver it caused, but she noticed. Her eyes lingered on yours, questioning, curious, but she said nothing. And in that silence, something unspoken grew louder between you. The days that followed only deepened it. Dinners, long walks, conversations that stretched into the night. Each time, you found yourself peeling back another layer, revealing parts of yourself you had kept hidden even from those closest to you. She listened without judgment, her gaze steady, her presence unwavering. In return, she shared her own scars, her own moments of doubt and fear, weaving a thread of trust between you both. There were times you caught yourself staring, memorizing the curve of her face, the way her hands moved when she spoke, the gentleness in her smile. You realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that you were falling, not in the reckless, hurried way of youth, but in the deliberate, steady way of someone who knows the cost of love and still chooses to risk it. The first time she reached for your hand, it was so natural you almost didn't notice until your fingers were already tangled together. The world around you seemed to quiet, as if everything had stepped aside to give you this moment. You felt her thumb brush softly against your skin, and for the first time in decades, you didn't want to pull away. You wanted to hold on, to memorize every detail, to let yourself feel without shame. The simple act of her hand in yours carried more weight than any words could have. It was a promise, fragile but real, that you didn't have to walk alone anymore. At night, lying in bed, you replayed those moments in your mind, clutching them like treasures. You felt alive in a way you hadn't in years, like your heart had been sleeping and was finally waking up. And yet, beneath the joy, there was also fear. You knew what it meant to want this, what it meant to step into the truth after so many years of silence. But the fear was no longer enough to silence the hope. Hope was growing louder, stronger, with every message, every smile, every stolen glance. And with it came the quiet, undeniable truth: you were falling in love. It was easier to fall for her than it was to face the storm that followed inside you. The more you allowed yourself to lean into her presence, the more you felt a gnawing weight press against your chest, a fear you couldn't silence no matter how much you tried to drown it out with her laughter. For every soft touch, every look that made your heart stumble, there came a voice in the back of your mind reminding you of the world outside the bubble you had built together. What would people say? What would your family think? Could you really start this kind of love at 40, after years of pretending to be someone you weren't? The questions were relentless, and they turned moments of happiness into an ache of uncertainty. You began to notice how careful you were in public. Walking together on the street, you kept a small distance between you, afraid of letting your hands brush. At restaurants, you caught yourself lowering your voice when conversations turned personal, worried that the wrong word might catch the attention of someone nearby. Even when she reached for your hand under the table, your body tensed before it softened into the comfort of her touch. She noticed. She noticed everything. One evening, she looked at you with eyes that were kind but heavy, and she asked, "Are you ashamed of me?" The words struck like lightning. You shook your head too quickly, desperate to erase the doubt, but the truth was complicated. You weren't ashamed of her, you were ashamed of yourself, of the years spent hiding, of the fear that still chained you even now. You didn't know how to explain the weight of decades, how the habit of silence becomes a prison you don't escape easily. The conflict grew inside you. On one hand, she gave you something you had longed for your whole life, the warmth of being seen and accepted. On the other, every step closer to her felt like walking into a battlefield, one where you weren't sure if you had the strength to fight. Nights became restless. You would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of voices from the past, parents, friends, colleagues, each one carrying judgment, disapproval, rejection. You imagined their faces if they knew. You imagined the conversations, the whispers, the way their eyes would change when they looked at you. And yet, when you thought of walking away from her, the pain of that loss was unbearable. The thought of living without her felt heavier than the fear of being seen. One evening, after a long day filled with these thoughts, you met her at the park. The air was cool, leaves rustling around you, the world softened by the coming night. She looked at you, searching your face, and without asking, she seemed to know. She said softly, "You're scared." You wanted to deny it, but the words caught in your throat. She didn't push. She just sat there, her hand brushing yours, giving you space to breathe. Finally, the dam inside broke, and the truth spilled out. You told her about the years of hiding, about the fear that had wrapped itself around you like chains, about the voice that told you it was too late. Your words trembled, your eyes burned, but she listened in silence, her gaze steady, her touch grounding. When you finished, she didn't lecture you or dismiss your fears. She simply whispered, "I don't need you to be fearless. I just need you to be real with me." Her words sank deep, settling into the cracks where your doubt lived. But fear doesn't vanish overnight. Even after that conversation, you found yourself caught between two worlds. At work, you played the same role you had always played, competent, reserved, guarded. Around family, you wore the mask of stability, pretending nothing in your life had changed. Then there was the other world, the one that belonged to her, where your heart beat differently, where laughter came easily, where you could almost believe you deserved this love. Moving between those worlds felt like tearing yourself in half, and each day, the strain grew heavier. There were moments you almost pulled away, convincing yourself that letting her go would be easier than carrying the weight of fear. But then you would remember the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams, or how she held your hand like it was something precious, or the way your chest felt lighter when she leaned against you. Those moments anchored you, reminded you that love wasn't supposed to be easy, it was supposed to be real. And real meant messy, complicated, terrifying, but also worth fighting for. Still, the question lingered in your mind, the one you could never fully silence. Could you actually give yourself fully to her? Could you stand against the doubts, the stares, the whispers, the years of silence that had taught you to hide? Each time she looked at you with trust in her eyes, you felt the weight of that choice pressing down harder. Love had found you at 40, but love was asking for something in return, the courage to finally step out of the shadows you had been living in all your life. The breaking point arrived not in one sudden moment, but in a series of small cracks that finally split open. You had been carrying your fear like a second skin, but love has a way of demanding space, of refusing to stay quiet when it deserves to be heard. One evening, after a long day of carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations, you met her for dinner. The restaurant was cozy, dimly lit, and her face glowed softly in the candlelight. She reached across the table, fingers brushing yours, her eyes filled with a gentleness that should have brought comfort, yet instead, it set your chest tightening. You pulled your hand back without meaning to, the reflex of someone who had lived too long in hiding. The look on her face was not anger, but hurt, sharp, deep, and silent. And in that silence, the truth became undeniable. You couldn't keep asking her to give you her whole heart while you gave her only the pieces you were brave enough to show. You went home that night with guilt pressing so heavily against your ribs it felt like you couldn't breathe. You lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the echo of her voice in your head, softer now, distant, as if she was already slipping away. Questions came at you from all sides. What if she grew tired of waiting for you to be brave? What if she decided she deserved someone who didn't flinch at her touch in public? What if, after finally finding something so rare, you lost it simply because you couldn't silence your fear? The thought of losing her was unbearable, yet the thought of stepping fully into the truth terrified you just as much. You felt trapped, torn between two choices, each carrying a kind of pain you weren't sure you could bear. Days passed, and the distance between you grew. She was still kind, still present, but you felt her pulling back, protecting herself. She no longer reached for your hand as often, no longer filled silences with easy laughter. She was giving you space, and that space felt like a cold emptiness you had created. One afternoon, she asked if you could take a walk together. You met at the park, where autumn leaves scattered around your feet, and the air was filled with the faint smell of change. She walked beside you quietly for a long time, and then she stopped. Turning to you, her voice was steady, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I can't be your secret," she said. The words cut deeper than anything else could have, because you knew she wasn't giving an ultimatum out of anger, she was simply stating her truth, a truth you couldn't deny. You wanted to promise her everything right then. You wanted to say the words that would erase the doubt from her eyes. But the fear tightened its grip, whispering of judgment, rejection, the possibility of losing everything else you had built. You stood there, silent, torn, while she waited. And when you couldn't speak, she nodded as though she understood, even if it broke her. She turned away, walking ahead slowly, giving you time to catch up, but in that moment, you felt the distance stretching like an ocean between you. That night, you sat in your car outside your home for nearly an hour before going inside, staring at the glow of the street lamps, the world moving around you. For the first time, the loneliness you had once accepted as normal now felt unbearable. You realized you could lose her. You could actually lose the one person who had managed to break through the walls you had built around yourself for decades. The thought hollowed you out, left you trembling. And for the first time, your fear of losing her outweighed your fear of the world's judgment. You didn't have the answers yet, didn't know how to face the conversations, the stares, the whispers. But you knew one thing with a certainty that made your heart ache. You didn't want to live another day pretending she wasn't the love you had been waiting for all along. The crisis wasn't about her anymore. It was about you, about whether you would finally choose yourself, choose your truth, choose the love that had been offered to you so freely. You went to bed that night knowing the silence could not last much longer. Something had to give. Either you would step into the light, or you would lose the one thing that had finally made your heart feel alive. The decision did not arrive with fireworks or a sudden burst of courage. It came quietly, in the kind of stillness that forces you to face yourself without distraction. One morning, as the sun broke through your curtains, you sat at the edge of your bed, staring at your hands. They were trembling, not from weakness but from the weight of all that was pressing on you. You thought of her face, the way her smile could light up a room, the way her voice softened when she spoke to you, the way she had held your hand as though it were something sacred. And then you thought of the look in her eyes that last evening in the park, the mixture of love and pain, the silent plea for you to be braver than your fear. That image became the mirror you couldn't turn away from anymore. You realized that every day you stayed silent was a day you chose fear over love, and for the first time, you admitted to yourself that love deserved better than that. So you reached for your phone, heart racing as though it might tear through your chest, and you called her. The pause before she answered felt endless, and when her voice came through, quiet and cautious, you almost lost your words. But you didn't. You told her you needed to see her, that you couldn't let things stay as they were. There was hesitation in her tone, a fragile edge that revealed how deeply she had been hurt, but she agreed. That evening, you met her at the same park where everything had nearly fallen apart. The air was crisp, the sky washed in soft shades of pink and gray, as if the world itself had been painted in hesitation. You stood before her, every muscle tense, but you didn't hold back this time. You told her everything. You told her how afraid you had been, how the years of silence had wrapped around you so tightly it felt impossible to breathe. You confessed the shame, the doubt, the nights spent awake wondering if you were too late to claim the kind of love you had always wanted. And then you told her the truth that sat deeper than all of that you loved her, that you had never felt anything like what you felt when you were with her, and that you could no longer let fear steal from you what your heart had finally found. Your voice cracked, your chest shook, but you didn't stop. For a long time, she said nothing. The world around you seemed to hold its breath, the rustle of the leaves, the distant hum of traffic, even the air itself seemed suspended in waiting. You searched her face, afraid you had said too much, afraid it was too late. But then she stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears, and she whispered, "That's all I wanted. Not perfection. Not fearlessness. Just the truth." When she reached for your hand this time, you didn't hesitate. You let your fingers entwine with hers, holding on as if your life depended on it. In that moment, something inside you broke free. It wasn't that the fear vanished completely, it was that it no longer had control. You realized courage didn't mean being unafraid, it meant choosing love in spite of the fear. And as you stood there, hand in hand with the woman who had changed everything, you felt the ground beneath you steady for the first time in years. The days that followed were not magically free of doubt. There were moments when you still flinched at the thought of whispers, when you worried about what family or friends might say. But each time, she reminded you with her presence, with her touch, with her steady gaze, that love was worth every risk. And slowly, step by step, you began to believe it. You found yourself reaching for her hand in public without thinking, letting the world see what had once been hidden. You began to let go of the masks, piece by piece, learning to stand in your truth not just in private, but in the open. It wasn't a grand revolution, but a quiet, steady choice you made each day, to love her without apology, to love yourself enough to stop hiding, to allow happiness into your life even if it terrified you. And with every choice, the bond between you grew stronger, not because it was flawless, but because it was real. You began to understand that at 40, life doesn't demand you to have all the answers, it simply asks you to have the courage to follow your heart. And finally, you were beginning to do just that. The day you finally allowed yourself to imagine a future with her was not extraordinary to anyone else, but to you, it felt like the quiet birth of a new life. You were sitting together on her couch, the evening soft around you, her head resting gently on your shoulder. The television played in the background, but neither of you were paying attention. Instead, you were lost in the steady rhythm of her breathing, the comfort of her closeness, the way her hand fit so naturally into yours. For so long, you had believed that love had to be loud and dramatic to mean something, but in that moment, you realized love could also be this, a stillness that felt like safety, a silence that healed instead of hurt. You turned your face toward her, and she looked back, her eyes holding yours without fear, without doubt, without hesitation. And for the first time, you let yourself believe that this was not temporary. This was home. At 40, you had thought your chances had passed, that love like this belonged to younger years, to people braver than you had been. But now you understood how wrong that was. Love does not ask for permission from age. It does not wait for the right time or the right place. It arrives when it is meant to, and if you are lucky enough to recognize it, you must be willing to open your hands and hold it. You thought of all the years wasted in silence, all the nights you had stared at ceilings, aching for something you could not name. You thought of the countless times you had convinced yourself it was too late. And then you looked at her again, at the woman sitting beside you, smiling softly, her thumb brushing absent-mindedly against your skin, and you realized none of that time had been wasted if it had led you here. Every scar, every regret, every tear had carved the path that had brought you to this very moment. The world outside was still the same. There would always be people with their judgments, their questions, their inability to understand. But something inside you had shifted. Their voices no longer carried the same power. You were no longer willing to trade your happiness for their approval. Love had taught you something that fear never could, that living half a life is no life at all. To deny yourself joy, to deny yourself truth, was to deny yourself the very reason you were here. And now, after years of silence, you were ready to live fully. One evening, as you walked together through the park where so many of your turning points had taken place, she slipped her arm through yours and leaned close. The leaves crunched under your feet, the air was cool, and the sky above stretched wide and endless. She looked at you with a mischievous smile and asked softly, "So, when you're 40, will you marry a woman?" The question was playful, but her eyes carried a seriousness beneath it, a quiet vulnerability that waited for your answer. You stopped walking, turning to face her fully, and for once, there was no hesitation, no trembling in your voice. You smiled, your heart steady, and whispered, "Yes. If she'll have me." Her laughter spilled into the air, light and beautiful, before she pressed her forehead against yours. In that small gesture, you felt the weight of everything that had once held you back finally dissolve. The fear, the doubt, the years of hiding, they no longer defined you. What defined you now was the love you had chosen, the love you had been brave enough to fight for, the love that had been waiting patiently for you to stop running. You kissed her then, not out of desperation or fear of losing her, but out of the fullness of finally allowing yourself to love openly. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, your life began to reshape itself around this truth. Family conversations that once filled you with dread became opportunities to stand in your honesty. Friends who mattered celebrated your happiness, while others who could not accept it slowly faded away. And though there were moments of pain in that process, they were nothing compared to the joy of waking each day beside the woman you loved. You learned that courage is not about shouting your truth to the world, but about living it quietly, consistently, until it becomes undeniable. At 40, you discovered that the question was never about age or possibility. It was about worth. Were you worth the love you had always dreamed of? Were you worth the freedom of being seen for who you truly were? And finally, after a lifetime of doubt, you had your answer. Yes. You were worth it. Worth the love, worth the risk, worth the life that was unfolding with every step you took alongside her. And as you held her hand, walking forward into a future that was still uncertain but no longer lonely, you understood that this was not the end of your story, it was the beginning of everything you had been waiting for.